The Whispering House. A long time ago, somewhere in America where foxes say goodnight, there was a village with a dense, dark forest near it. The villagers were scared of the forest. They believed that a house that had been abandoned for decades stood deep in the woods. There were stories of strange occurrences tied to the house, tales of people who had ventured inside but never returned. However, most dismissed these stories as nothing more than urban legends. For Hannah, these were the exact stories she had always loved. She was a writer, and she always adored scary stories. They were part of her life, her passion, her obsession. She was chasing after them in search of something new and more frightening than ever before. And when she heard about this house, she knew she had to investigate. Armed with only a flashlight, a notebook, and a camera, she set out on a cold October afternoon. The forest path was long and winding, the trees closing around her with every step. After a while, Hannah lost the path completely, but somehow she knew where to go. The inner sense told her that the most challenging path was the correct one. She was struggling her way through the forest, and finally, covered with scratches, she found it. Overgrown with vines and hidden beneath a thick canopy of trees, it was the sort of place people instinctively avoided, as if nature itself was trying to swallow it whole. By the time she arrived, dusk had already settled, casting long shadows over the house's rotting facade. It looked much larger than she expected. 3 stories tall with a sagging roof and broken windows like hollow eyes staring into the abyss. Hannah felt a chill as she approached the front door. She was frightened. She still had a chance to turn around and leave, but Hannah was tough. "It's just a house," she told herself. She decided to enter. The old wooden door creaked open easily, as if it had been waiting for her. The interior smelled of damp wood and decay. The air was thick with dust. It seemed like the house was trying to suffocate her, or at least fear her away. But still, Hannah wasn't ready to give up so quickly, so she ventured inside the house. Her footsteps echoed as she entered, the floorboards groaning even though she was fit. And after a very short time it began. The house started whispering to her. At first, the whispers were faint, barely audible over the house's creaking. But as she moved deeper into the hallway, they grew louder. She paused, shining her flashlight around, but the beam revealed nothing unusual. Just peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and shattered glass. She had drawn a brief sketch into her notebook and made a few notes about the eerie atmosphere. But she felt something more. She couldn't describe it, but it was like something was standing right behind her back. But when she turned around, she saw nothing more than darkness. As she continued exploring, the whispers grew insistent. Hannah couldn't understand a word. It was like a dozen voices overlapping in the darkness, speaking in a language too difficult for her to understand. Hannah's heart began to race as she tried to focus on her task, pushing her fear to the back of her mind. She wandered into what seemed to be the living room with a chandelier on the verge of falling. In the corner stood a grand piano, its keys yellowed with age. Hannah loved playing the piano. She would never admit she was good, but I wish you heard her playing. Her passion took the better of her as she walked over and pressed one of the keys. The sound that followed was not a note, it was a deafening scream. Hannah recoiled, her breath catching in her throat. Her hands were trembling. That wasn't possible. It had to be her imagination, but the whispers returned. This time they were louder and more distinct. She still couldn't understand them, but one word was clear. "Leave," they seemed to say repeatedly. Despite her fear, Hannah pressed on. She wasn't about to let a few creepy voices scare her off. Trying to explore a little more, Hannah climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor. At the top of the stairs, she found herself in a long hallway lined with doors. All of them were closed, except for the one at the very end of the hallway. Even though she was frightened, Hannah was inexplicably attracted towards the door. She wanted to leave, but she couldn't force herself to. She reached the door and pushed it open, revealing a small bedroom. The bed was made, the sheets neatly tucked in, though they were covered in a thick layer of dust. On the wall opposite the bed hung a large mirror, its surface smeared with grime. Hannah stepped closer to the mirror, her reflection barely visible through the dirt. Then she saw it. A shadow moved behind her, something tall and formless, hovering just beyond the edge of her vision. She spun around, but the room was empty. Her pulse raced as she turned back to the mirror, her reflection distorted, her face elongated, her eyes sunken and hollow. She heard the whispers again. This time they were unbearably loud, cruel, and mocking. "Get out!" they screamed. "You shouldn't be here." Hannah stumbled backward, her head spinning. The house seemed to close in around her. Now Hannah was scared for her life. She dropped her flashlight. The beam was flickering wildly as it rolled across the floor. The air grew colder, freezing her breath in front of her face. Panicking, Hannah stormed for the door, but it slammed shut in front of her face. She pounded on the wood, but it wouldn't budge. She was screaming, but it seemed like a whisper in a deafening cacophony of 1,000 voices shouting at her. "Leave! Leave now, or stay with us forever!" Desperate, she ran to the window and tried to shatter the glass. But it was hopeless. It was as if the house had trapped her and wanted to feast on her fear. She was desperately searching for a way out. The mirror drew her gaze again. This time, the shadow was more apparent. It resembled a grotesque figure with elongated limbs and a featureless face. It moved closer. Hannah's breath came in ragged gasps as she backed into the corner. She felt the cold walls pressing against her skin. The thing stepped forward, savoring every bit of Hannah's terror. "Help me," she whispered. Her voice was trembling, but she knew no one would hear her. The thing reached for her. She tried to push it away, but her hand just went through the darkness. Suddenly, the whispers turned into complete silence. Hannah squeezed her eyes shut, expecting the worst. Her body was shaking with fear. But instead of the cold final kiss of darkness, she heard a deep voice. It was soft, almost gentle. "Run." Her eyes snapped open. The shadow stepped back. Its head was tilted as if inspecting Hannah with the most profound interest. Then, without warning, the door flew open. Hannah didn't think twice. She sprinted down the hallway, her feet barely touching the ground as she descended the stairs 2 or 3 at a time. The front door opened, and as she burst through, it slammed shut, never to open again. Hannah was running in fear all the way back to the village. She looked back, expecting to see the house looming behind her, but there was nothing. Only a thick, impenetrable forest. Hannah collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She had survived. But she knew that deep in the forest, where the villagers are too afraid to set foot, the house is waiting for its next visitor.